try this again. Can you tell me your name and title, please?
Jacqueline Lopez. I'm a staff attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity.
All right, great. What are the macula of rays, seaside sparrow, and the Florida Keys mole skink, and why are they worth saving?
So the sparrow is a coastal species. It's actually a subpopulation with about 5 or 6 other subspecies cousins, but it's the southernmost. And it historically extended down into Volusia County, and in more recent years has been experiencing decline due to habitat impacts. So habitat impacts such as sedimentation, fragmentation, development along our coastlines. And it extends all the way up to North Carolina, but it's mostly a Florida species, with the majority of the breeding and the nesting going on around Duval and Nassau counties. Now the mole skink, which has an unattractive name but is actually quite beautiful, is about 5 inches long, and it's a slender, skinks are lizard-like species, except they're sort of glassier looking, they have smoother scales, and the Florida Keys mole skink is beautifully colored, pink and white, and it's a coastal species as well, so it nests in our loose sands down in the Keys, which is where it gets its name. And it's a species that's not very well understood, but the best estimates are that it's experiencing about a 10 to 30% decline more recently. And again, the threats are similar to the sparrow in terms of historic impacts to habitat with coastal development.
And coastal species like that could be threatened by sea level rise. Tell us about what causes sea level rise and why, or how much of an impact you might expect in Florida.
Right, so sea level rise is primarily driven by climate change. Specifically, warming oceans are creating thermal. Can I start that one over again?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Sea level rise is primarily driven by climate change. Now what that means for sea level rise is we have thermal expansion due to warming waters, but we also have melting sea and land ice, which is contributing to the overall global mean sea level rise. We've been able to trace this historically, so over the last 100 years there's been about 7 to 8 inches of global sea level rise. And I keep saying global because it's not equal along all coastlines. In Florida, northern Florida is actually on track or above the global estimates for the next 100 years. So by the end of the century, our conservative estimates are about 2 feet of sea level rise. And the estimates that track what we're currently on our greenhouse gas emissions, because you can track the two sort of side by side, indicate that we could be up to 6 feet. So this has significant impacts for not just our coastal species, but of course coastal Floridians. In Florida, no one's really more than 75 miles away from our coast, so this has profound impacts for the entire state.
What do you think that sea level rise, whether it's a couple of feet or more, how could it affect this skink and this sparrow?
Right, so the impact for coastal species is particularly acute with sea level rise because they face this phenomenon known as coastal squeeze, which means that their existing habitat, which is totally dependent along coastal ecosystems. For the sparrow, it's brackish marshes. For the skink, it's our sandy shorelines. And with the rising sea levels on the one side and coastal development on the other, its habitat and where it can escape to as far as suitable alternate habitat is quickly diminishing.
The Endangered Species Act is supposed to protect species that are threatened or endangered. What types of protections should these organisms, the sparrow and the skink, be getting from the Endangered Species Act?
So the lawsuit that we've launched is intended to provide these Endangered Species Act protections. The skink is already recognized in Florida as a species of special concern, and the sparrow doesn't really share that designation. But under the Federal Endangered Species Act, the protections include everything from direct harm, so collecting the species or killing it, those types of activities where it's a very physical, tangible, immediate impact, to impacts to habitat and the designation of critical habitat, which attaches another series of protections which ensures that the activities that we undertake don't impact the quality of that habitat, so that the species at least has a place where it can continue to go on with its basic life functions like breeding, eating, nesting. You're
suing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. What do you hope will be the outcome?
So we're hoping that the service will move forward with a listing designation for the species. So species are not guaranteed any of the protections of the Act until they have formal protections or listing. So we're asking the service to move forward with a final decision on these species. We had initially petitioned the agency to list these species under the Act a few years ago, and the Act, because of the purpose of which it's charged to deal with is the imminent extinction of species, Congress also attached to the Act mandatory deadlines to push through these listings when the science indicates that that's what needs to happen. And in this case, the agency has made an initial determination that listing may be warranted, and now we're asking it to make that final step and give it the proposed and final listing rules.
And finally, reptiles and amphibians in particular are being affected quite a lot lately. For example, this skink. What's the let me start that over. What makes reptiles and amphibians so vulnerable?
Yeah, so the Southeast is blessed with a remarkable array of biodiversity, and in particular reptiles and amphibians, but also crayfish and sort of the less sexy species like mussels. And so we've seen a dramatic decline in the Southeast in particular. Now historically that has been due to the way that we treat our freshwater resources, between impoundments and pollution loading and strains on our groundwater. And those factors combined have diminished the quality and quantity of the flow that we have in our freshwater. Now for reptiles and amphibians in particular, that threat is multiplied by pollutants in our environment, such as pesticides. They're particularly sensitive to these things because their skin is somewhat permeable, and they're a lot more vulnerable to those threats. So all of these historic impacts from our human-built environment, coupled now with the threats of climate change, in particular in Florida, sea level rise, is really pushing these species to the brink.
Great, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.